when I was a kid, I wanted to be a commando. Like, I don't really remember wanting to do anything else. When I realized that there was that role that you could play in life, that's what I wanted to do. And a lot of my friends in the SEAL teams were the same way. That's what they wanted to do. And as soon as they figured out, like, oh, that exists. Oh, I can do that. And I just have to sign this piece of paper and go do this stuff. And then that's what I'll be. Where does that come from?
Well, I mean, that's a very good question. I mean, I would say it's temperamental. You know, people differ tremendously in their temperaments, and to think that there's a warrior temperament is a perfectly reasonable thing to think. I mean, there's been whole cultures, many cultures, who are devoted to fostering that warrior mentality, you know, where if you weren't like that, you were the outlier. I would say that's probably true of most human cultures across most of time. You know, we've been fortunate enough to live in relatively peaceful times, at least the vast majority of us, so the necessity for that, like right at the edges of actual warfare, is much less than it might be under other historical circumstances. But it's a deep part of many people's nature. And so the question is, what do you do with that, right? And I mean, one alternative potentially is criminal behavior. And you know, the fact that so many people like watching movies about bad guys, you know, is an indication of how attractive that is to people. And I think the reason for that is that, well, Nietzsche observed at one point that most of what people regard as morality is just cowardice. And what he meant by that was that people don't do bad things not because they're good, but because they're afraid to do the bad things. And then when they see people do the bad things, they're actually really deeply attracted by that, because it speaks to part of them that could go beyond the rules. And that's actually a necessary part. It's a really necessary part. Like, you don't make men safe by making them weak. In fact, they're much more dangerous when they're weak, because they'll stab you in the back when they get the chance, or take advantage of you when they get the chance. You make men safe, let's say, by making them strong, and then by making sure that they're disciplined. And so, you know, you've got people like you have got this, let's say, warrior mentality that's a deep part of their temperament, and then you have some choices about what you might do with that. You might try to discipline it and bring it under voluntary control and integrate it into your character, in which then it can make you someone who's stalwart and indomitable and who will move forward, you know, in the face of tremendous risk. And well, that's the optimal pathway if you have that kind of temperament. I think, like, it's the men that have the most, what would you call it? It's not aggressive exactly, but we'll leave it at that. Aggressive and fearless temperaments that can be the best men. But it's like having a very powerful dog. You better discipline it, because otherwise it's going to be a monster.
Yeah. Well, I was a rebellious kid, right? And I could have easily gone down the path of crime. And as a matter of fact, many of my friends that I, you know, left when they stayed at home, they did end up as criminals and having big trouble with the law, or going down even paths of drugs and everything else that you can get into. But when we were kids or younger, everyone kind of had the same thing. But like you said, I'm so lucky, because I just signed that piece of paper and I saw that I could do something, and I could take all that aggression and all that energy, and I could do something that was good and positive. And we joke about that in the SEAL teams, that many guys, you actually, to be a good SEAL, you sort of have this criminal mindset that you've somehow harnessed and you keep under control most of the time.
Yeah.
And occasionally it does get out of hand, and we got guys that get in trouble, and that happens. And if we only took guys that would never get in trouble, we wouldn't have anyone in the ranks, really.
Yeah. Well, you also see too in the classic hero stories. I mean, you see this with Harry Potter, for example, which I'm making reference to because it was such a phenomena. I mean, when something makes welfare mother richer than the Queen of England, you shouldn't take note, right? And when kids are reading 500-page books and standing in line waiting for the next one, and when you produce a whole movie empire around something, you should take note of that. Well, Harry Potter's little team aren't the delinquents, right, who have no discipline, but they're also not the good kids. They're the kids who will break rules when necessary, and that's the issue. Break rules when necessary. Now, the question is, when is that necessary? Well, that's sort of the ultimate ethical choice. But, why did that work for you, do you think? Why was it? Well, two questions. One would be, why did you decide to step into a disciplined structure? I mean, that's obviously very difficult. And why do you think you did that and some of the other kids that you knew that were like you didn't?
It was really one of the most rebellious things that I could do was to join the military. So I come from a small New England town. People get done with high school, they go to college, they get a job as whatever people get jobs as. They follow that very normal path. And I didn't even know anyone that joined the military. And so that was the most rebellious thing I could do. Oh, college? No. Education? No. I'm going to go be a commando. That's what I'm going to do. And it was the most rebellious thing I could do. I think that's one of the reasons why I did it. It was also a complete breakaway from, family. Oh, okay, I will have no reliance on you. I'm going. You don't have to worry about me anymore. I'm done. I will not rely on anyone else. I will be self-reliant, which I wanted to do. And so I think those are the main things that got me there. And then what's great about it for me was when I got there, you have a completely blank slate and you have very clear directions of what you need to do to ascend the dominance hierarchy. You do this, you follow these rules, you literally fold your underwear in this way when you're going through boot camp and you get a better grade on your military performance. So they give you very clear rules that you're supposed to follow and very clear tasks that you had to do. And it was great for me because it was a blank slate, because when I was in high school, I was a screw up. Not bad, but not good. And so I hadn't really set myself up properly. And now all of a sudden, all I had to do, that was all gone. It didn't matter. The past did not matter at all. I had a completely blank slate. If you do this stuff properly, you'll do well and you'll ascend that.
Yeah, well,
that hierarchy.
That's a very interesting thing, because then it's not merely a matter of following a set of arbitrary rules. It's following a set of rules that have a clear path to success, right? That's a very different thing, and that's also something that's honest, because the rules of the game are well established, and then if you play it properly, you get to win. And that's a big deal as well. And you mentioned the SEAL types, and I've met a number of people like that. They're capable of breaking rules, let's say, or maybe even inclined to break them. But I also think that this is part of the reason that I'm an admirer of Carl Jung, because Jung makes it very clear that, see, he was very interested in the barriers to enlightenment. Because if there's such a thing as being enlightened, let's say, then why isn't everyone enlightened? If it's just a matter of taking the glorious route and following your bliss, let's say, it's like, well, that sounds pretty easy. Why isn't everyone enlightened? But Jung's thinking isn't like that at all. He believed that in order to transform your personality, that first of all, you had to be disciplined, that's for sure. But you also had to integrate that part of you that was terrible and capable of breaking rules and make it part of you. And so then, and I really like that idea. Well, here's an example. So about 20 years ago, I would say, there was a newspaper headline in one of Canada's major newspapers, and it was the Minister of Foreign Affairs at that time, Lloyd Axworthy, and he was talking about what had happened with Milosevic in the former Soviet Union, in Yugoslavia, and the atrocities that were being committed. And he said that he was caught unawares by that because he didn't have the imagination for that kind of evil. And I thought, well, you think that what you're doing is signaling your virtue by making a statement like that. But from my perspective, all you're doing is stating your cowardice and your historical ignorance, because if you're going to be Minister of Foreign Affairs, you bloody well better have imagination for that kind of evil. Because if you don't, then anyone who does wins. They beat you. And so again, in the Harry Potter stories, you see, he's touched by evil, right? He actually has a soul fragment that's embedded within him that's as black as anything can possibly be. That's why he can talk to snakes. But without that, he wouldn't be able to have any victory. And that's exactly right psychologically. Unless you can think the way that an evil person thinks, then you're defenseless against them, because they'll go places you can't imagine, and then they win. And so the best men I've met, it was interesting even when I was in junior high and high school, because most of my friends dropped out, by the time they were grade 10, thereabouts. And a lot of them were guys who developed physically. They're pretty powerful, and they're just damn sick of putting up their hand to go to the bathroom. It was like, they're not doing that anymore. One of my friends got kicked out when he sort of challenged the gym teacher, physically. And the gym teacher, he could do an iron cross. He was a tough guy, and so it was no trivial matter for my friend to stand up to him, but he got expelled anyways. But, I noticed that it was often the kids whose character I admired that either quit or got expelled, and they were the tougher guys who were just sick and tired of following rules that didn't take into account their character, and then they'd go off and work in the oil rigs or whatever, and you could do that in Alberta at that time. And that was really hard work, so it wasn't like they were necessarily taking the easy path. But like, a harmless man is not a good man. A good man is a very, very dangerous man who has that under voluntary control. And you also see that like one of the central female stories, let's say, if the hero archetype is the central male story, there are variants of hero archetypes that are relevant to women, and one of them is Beauty and the Beast. And Beauty isn't interested in the guy who isn't the beast. She's interested in the guy who's the beast, and that's exactly right, but she's interested in the guy who's the beast that can be civilized and disciplined, right, and who can use that in the service, well, let's say, of a family. And that's exactly how it should be.
So I gave a speech. One of my very good friends got married a few years ago, and I gave a speech. And at this speech, he was a friend of mine, Seal. And at this speech, I was talking about what it was to be a man and when I felt like I was a man. And I said there was three things that I felt let me transition from being, mentally insecure about who I was as a person to being, okay, I'm actually good with who I am. Number one was learning how to fight. Mm-hmm. And, I got into Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and mixed martial arts, and I learned how to fight. And now, all of a sudden, when I looked at other people, I wasn't posturing. I wasn't trying to pretend that I was tough. I knew that most people that I would encounter, I could defeat in a physical altercation. That was number one. Number two was going into combat. Because even though you might be tough in a street fight or in a fist fight with someone, when you're facing death, well, that's a whole nother level. And for me, going into combat, well, what was I going to act like? Was I going to be scared? Was I going to be a coward? Was I going to be scared of death? And when I went into combat, I wasn't. I was fine. I was okay with the fact that I could die, and I was okay with that. And I made good decisions and did what I was supposed to do. And the last one was I got married and had kids. Because all of a sudden, all these things, these being aggressive and working to fight and be able to destroy in an efficient way, well, then I took that and combined it with, okay, now I'm going to take care of my wife and our children, and that's what I'm going to do. And my point in giving this speech was he was a guy that had learned how to fight. He was a guy that had been in combat, and now there was one more step to take, which was, okay, now you're going to get married and you're going to take care of these people. So it's interesting that once again, that dichotomy that you talk about, it fits perfectly into the way I figured things out as a guy that went to high school and joined the military. It's kind of crazy, but it reinforces what you always say, which is that there's deeper meaning. There's a reason why I'm thinking that, and the reason is because of the things that you talk about and the way these things are overlaid throughout history for human beings to have gotten to this point.
Yeah, well, you acted it out, which is what you're supposed to do, and it's better to act it out and to understand it. That's best. It's better to understand it and not act it out than to not understand it at all. But the best is to act it out and understand it. And because then you can, then the way that you represent the world and yourself is in accordance with the way that you act, and that's optimized.
Yeah, and it's something that I was kind of acting out again. No real guide. Like my guidelines were like I was raised in the SEAL teams. That was sort of my guidelines. And here's a good example. When I first got in the SEAL teams, there was no war going on. So what did a good SEAL do? You know what you did? You went out and drank and got in bar fights. Mm-hmm. That's what a good SEAL did. So you know what I did? Went out and drank, got in bar fights. That's what I'm supposed to do. It took me a while to figure out, no, there's actually something more than that. Like we're actually supposed to be preparing for war. And so now, like you said, I definitely acted things out and sort of was on a decent path. But as I got older and more mature, and to this day, as I can look around and actually overlay the understanding on the way I've carried out my life, it's very helpful to me. And it also helps me explain it to other people that see the path that I'm on and go, they like that path. They would like to join me on that path. And I get guys that, when I was in, I look like a serial killer for all practical purposes. That's the way I come across, right?
Not creepy enough.
There's guys that would, guys that would work for me or guys that would be around me, and they'd see me and they'd kind of latch on to the fact that I was tough and aggressive. And some of those guys, they wouldn't catch the other part, which was that I was politically savvy and I was working and I was maneuvering and I was, figuring things out and talking to my boss in such a way that we could get where we needed to be. And I was doing that whole other side. And so I'd get these guys that would end up not doing as well as they should do because they were just, hey, Jocko's just ultra aggressive and he gets after it. And so that's what I'm going to do. And I'll be in the same place. The guys that would do well are the guys that said, oh yeah, Jocko's awesome and he's aggressive and he gets after it. He's also working and he's also maneuvering and he's also massaging the egos of the people around him to make sure that they get positioned in the right spot where they can go to war in the right way. And so as I've gotten older, I've been able to tell people that more clearly, like, hey, it's not just about that side of the ultra aggressive. You got to be aggressive. You got to be willing to fight. You got to be willing to kill, and you got to be willing to die. At the same time, you got to be able to temper all those things in such a way that they can be controlled and disciplined.
Well, I also think that that's part of what makes a world peaceful in the final analysis, because if you're around people who are dangerous but disciplined, then everyone watches their step. And that's exactly what should happen. Everybody should watch their step. And if there's no reason for that, then, well, there's no sanction for poor behavior, for example.